Right, so this is the headline from the article. Do we need a new theory of evolution? And the subheading there, or the little summary: a new wave of scientists argues that mainstream evolutionary theory needs an urgent overhaul. Now that's interesting in itself. Um, their opponents dismiss them as misguided careerists. In other words, they're just doing this as a way of advancing their academic career, um, and the conflict may determine the future of biology. And the article begins with this statement: strange as it seems, scientists still do not know the answers to some of the most basic questions about how life on Earth evolved. And it goes on to say there are certain core evolutionary principles that no scientist seriously questions. Now, that's important because we'll just have a look at a few of those. Because there are scientists who seriously question them, mainly us, but of course, we're not considered to be scientists. Uh, But as we've just discussed, right, John and Craig and various others, we go out in the field, we actually look for evidence. That's science. But anyway, let's come back to this quote. Everyone agrees that natural selection plays a role, as does mutation and random chance. But how exactly these processes interact and whether other forces might also be at work has become the subject of a bitter dispute. So, what they're saying is that in the academic world, it's not all sweetness and light. And I know that from my own personal experience. I did work in the academic world for quite a while as a university lecturer, and it's not all sweetness and light. There's quite a lot of bitter disputes. But if the outside world critiques people, that they do close ranks fairly quickly. So notice he does say that the writer of this article, everyone agrees that natural selection plays a role, as does mutation and random chance. So we need to have a look at these processes. So this is the standard theory of evolution that most people know about and have in their mind without filling in the details. So the whole idea is, right, we started out with chemicals, we ended up with human beings, and this was a long process of increasing complexity. And the processes that actually drove this are natural selection, mutation, and random chance. Now, we need to say, from the point of view of scientific observation, uh, those things, natural selection, mutation, and random chance, are all real. And we agree with the evolutionists that those things exist. What we don't agree with is that they will cause chemicals to turn into people. We need to have a little bit of historical background, and this article does go into a fair bit of historical background. Um, we need to, excuse me, I'm still coughing from the residual effects of having the flu, so please forgive me. Anyway, this article looks at the history of those various ideas, but it doesn't say that we need a new theory of origins. So the article said, do we need a new theory of evolution, right? Not a new theory of origins. And those two things are different. The article assumes that evolution happened and is still happening. So don't anyone write to The Guardian and say, oh, how dare you say that the theory of evolution is wrong? They're not saying that. What they are saying is that there is a dispute about how it actually happens. And people who watch the BBC don't realise that. But the Guardian article does affirm, just as much as the BBC does and anybody else, that evolution did actually happen, is still happening. But back in the academic world, there's a dispute about how it happened. So we need to go back to what is the sort of wellspring of evolutionary theory. It's not the original origin of evolutionary theory, that goes back into the Greek world, actually, back into the ancient world. But in terms of the modern Western world, everyone puts it down to the theory of evolution became established with this book by Charles Darwin. So we need to have a look at that and look at, everyone thinks it's just called The Origin of Species, but it is worth having a look at the whole full topic, because in 19th century England, they did tend to have these rather long and involved titles for their books. And so on the origin of species, by means of natural selection. So that's where the natural selection that they're talking about in the Guardian article, by means of natural selection or the preservation of favoured races in the struggle for life. Now, straight away there, you've got a problem, because if you look at the two aspects of that title, origin and preservation are not the same thing. So in fact, the whole theory of evolution is really based on a piece of very bad English, right? Because origin and preservation are not the same thing. And that is where the problems have actually arisen. But everyone wanted evolution to happen. So in spite of the fact that this is an obvious piece of bad English, people grasped this whole idea very, very quickly. And we will discuss why that happened in the historical context. And the real problem that we can see, and that honest scientists in the background will admit, the term selection, natural selection, what does that mean in terms of a plain English word? Well, the word select just simply means to choose between already existing alternatives. And the Guardian article does actually admit that selection does not actually explain the origin of things. It comes in halfway into the story, as it were. So selection does not make any new kinds. Right. It only allows the already fit kinds to survive. So natural selection is often referred to as survival of the fittest. And we would agree, and the Guardian article agreed, those things are real. Right. In fact, selection can only eliminate some unfit kinds, and we'll talk about some real examples of that later on, particularly some Australian ones. So Darwinian evolution just arbitrarily denied the design and the designer that we see, that's obvious in the world around us now. It just assumes that there never was a design or a designer. Both Darwin did that, and this article does that as well. Now, we have a couple of programs which we've done on design. There's lots of evidence for design, so it's worth going back and having a look at that. Ultimately, Darwin's theory does not actually explain the origin of new structures and functions. If you read his book, it talks about lots of variation. It does talk about natural selection. That is a real process, and it's still going on today, and we can see it. So that's not in dispute. But Darwinian evolution just has no explanation for the ultimate origin of things. It just explains what happens to things after they have been after they've come into existence. So it just arbitrarily denies that there is any design, and denies that there is a designer. Right. Now, the theory was sorry, you have to excuse me again. Was in trouble for quite a while, because Darwin did not really explain where the things that where new features came from. But it sort of got saved when people discovered mutations, when the science of genetics got going. And so that's where those three things that are mentioned in the article, natural selection, mutations, and random processes. Well, mutations and random processes are tied up together. So it's worth having a look at mutations. because these are claimed to be what actually keeps evolution going. So mutations are simply changes in genetic information. Again, these are real. We observe them all the time. And in fact, they are considered to be the engine that drives evolution. And so this is from an article about genetics, written about 10 years or more than 10 years ago. But anyway, this is the mindset that most people have. This is mutations sort of saved the day, even though Darwin didn't only explain natural selection, he couldn't explain the origin of new things. But then when people discovered mutations, they thought, yes, that if we put this together. So mutation is the engine that drives evolution and adaptation forward, in that it generates the variation on which natural selection acts. So there we have a possible explanation for natural selection plus mutations giving us the evolutionary process. And the mindset is this, right? Mutations result in good and bad changes to genetic information, and natural selection acts as a sort of weeding out process. It weeds out the bad mutations, leaves the good mutations, and eventually over time, the good mutations build up and produce new living things. Now that's a nice idea, but out in the real world, there is a problem. There aren't any good mutations. No one's observed any good mutations, and the more we look into mutations and the more we look into how genetics works, the more this is affirmed. And we can understand that, because if you look at the things that cause mutations, they do actually result in random processes. So these are the things that cause mutations: radiation, chemicals. Those are things that come from outside. Now, there are also internal things that happen within our cells. Whenever our cells are reproduce, and that's going on all of the time, the DNA has to be copied, and sometimes you do get copying errors, right? And we do actually have inbuilt repair processes within our cells which are going on all the time, but occasionally these fail, and the end result is mutation. Now, none of those things are particularly good. They are all chance random processes, actually. And what they do is that they degrade in genetic information. So change is very real. Chance random processes are very real, but they're not going to produce evolution. Now, here's an example of where we've actually found this. A few years ago, there was a project called the 1,000 Genomes Project, which was a study of genetic variation using genetic sequences of over 1,000 human genomes, and they took them from a whole lot of different ethnic groups, and it ran over quite a few years. Now, in the end, they analysed more than just 1,000. They got up to 2,504. And a whole raft of papers, of scientific papers, came out from this. And their findings were not particularly edifying in terms of the theory of evolution. And this is from one paper that came out of this. Every newborn's DNA carries more than 60 new mutations. So mutations are very real, right? Some of which lead to birth defects, disease, including cancers. Now, those things are definitely not good. They're very real, and they do involve change. But those birth defects, disease, and cancer can hardly be called evolution. They're not going to increase in things in complexity. And in fact, we can say, right, mutations are definitely us, but we're not evolving. So if these things are real, how can we fit them into our worldview? Because what our whole sorry, I'm coughing again. One of the reasons that we exist is to show people that the theory of evolution doesn't work, and there is actually a better theory. So, do we need a new theory of evolution? No, we don't. We don't actually need a new theory of evolution. What we need is the original truth about origins. The paper in The Guardian affirms the fact or affirms the belief that evolution happened. It's not saying we need to throw out the theory of evolution and come up with something different. They're saying the argument is about how it happened, but in fact, they are missing the point. We don't need a new theory of evolution. What we need is the original truth about origins, right, where things really did come from the Creator. So, where do all of those processes fit in? Well, we just need to have a look at the big picture that's given by the Creator. The world started out good, but it didn't stay that way. Sin and judgment came into the world, and we are now living in a world where there is degeneration. Now, that's change, but it's not evolution. So, when we look at the real world using the scientific method, we will see design. Darwin just ignored design, and modern evolutionists just ignore design as well. When things started to go downhill, those processes that are ascribed to evolution actually did come into the world. They are real and we should be studying them. Natural selection is real, mutations are real, random chance is real. But all of those things are the result of the world going downhill, not increasing in complexity. Right. The world has definitely changed, but it hasn't evolved. Right. Now, that sounds like it's all bad news. And in a way it is. But there is good news. The world has changed, but God has not.